24. The envoys sent by the king with these instructions met Scipio in Syracuse. Scipio was now robbed of important support for his African campaign and also of his high hopes for it. But before the matter could become common knowledge, he quickly sent the envoys back to Africa with a letter for the king. In this, he time and again advised Sphax not to forswear his obligations of hospitality with him, or of the pact he had entered with the Roman people, and not to violate his religious duty, his honor, his solemn pledges, and the gods who witnessed and oversaw covenants. But it was not possible to keep the arrival of the Numidians secret. They had been wandering around the city, and had spent time at the headquarters, and by maintaining silence on the reason for their coming, Scipio risked having the truth come out through the very act of concealment. There was also a danger that fear of having to fight the king and the Carthaginians at the same time would sweep through the army. Scipio therefore steered his men away from the truth by seizing their attention with a lie. He summoned the soldiers to an assembly and said they could delay no longer, that the allied kings were insisting that he cross to Africa as soon as possible. Massinissa had earlier made a personal visit to Gaius Laelius, he said, complaining that time was being wasted through inaction. Now Sphax was sending envoys, for he too was wondering what reason there could be for the protracted delay, and he was demanding either that the army be finally taken over to Africa, or that he be informed of any change in plans, so that he could take appropriate steps for himself and his realm. And so, since all was ready and prepared, and since the situation would brook no further delay, he intended to take the fleet over to Lilybaeum. There he would concentrate all his infantry and cavalry forces, and on the first day that would permit the ships to sail, he would, with the favor of the gods, make the journey over to Africa. Scipio then sent a letter to Marcus Pomponius requesting that if he were in agreement, he come to Lilybaeum, so they could together discuss the specific legions, and the size of the force Scipio would take over to Africa. He also sent word along the entire coast for all freighters to be commandeered and brought together at Lilybaeum. When all the troops and ships in Sicily had mustered in Lilybaeum, the city would not hold all the men, nor the harbor all the ships, and such was the general enthusiasm for crossing to Africa, that they felt they were being led not to war, but to prizes of victory that were already assured. This was especially so with the remaining soldiers from the army of Cannae. They believed that it was under Scipio, that no one else, that they could discharge their duty to the state and bring to a close their ignominious conditions of service. In fact, Scipio did not disdain soldiers in this category. He was well aware that the defeat at Cannae was not the result of cowardice on their part, and that there were no soldiers in the Roman army as seasoned and as experienced as they in various forms of combat, but especially in blockading cities. The legions of Cannae were the 5th and 6th. Scipio declared that he would take them over to Africa, and then inspected the soldiers in them individually. Leaving behind those he thought unsuitable, He replaced them with men he had brought with him from Italy, and he provided supplementary troops for those legions to the point where each had 6,200 infantry and 300 cavalry. From the army from Cannae, Scipio also selected Latin infantry and cavalry for the campaign. '25. There is wide discrepancy in the sources on the number of troops taken over to Africa. In one I find 10,000 infantry and 2,200 cavalry. In another, 16,000 infantry and 1,600 cavalry. In a third, I find more than double this number, that 35,000 infantry and 3,000 cavalry were put aboard the ships. Some authors have not given a figure, and I would prefer to be in their company since the question is moot. While he avoids a precise figure, Coelius still exaggerates and gives the impression of huge numbers. He says that birds fell to the ground when the soldiers' shout went up, and that the numbers boarding the ships were so great that it appeared that no mortal was being left behind in either Italy or Sicily. Scipio took personal responsibility for ensuring that his men boarded the ships in a disciplined and orderly manner. Gaius Laelius, admiral of the fleet, made the seamen embark first and kept them on board. The praetor Marcus Pomponius was given responsibility for loading supplies. He had 45 days' worth of rations, including 15 days' worth of cooked provisions, put aboard. When all were now embarked on the vessels, Scipio sent some boats around them with instructions for helmsmen and captains, along with 2 soldiers from each ship, to come to a meeting in the forum to receive their orders. When these had gathered together, Scipio first asked them if they had put on board water for men and animals, and that would last for many days, as would the grain. When they replied that there was a 45-day supply of water on the ships, he directed the fighting men to remain calm and obey their orders, providing the seamen with the silence they needed to go about their duties without interruption. He added that he and Lucius Scipio would, with 20 warships, over the freighter's protection on the right wing, and the same number of warships under Gaius Laelius, commander of the fleet, and Marcus Porcius Cato, quaestor at the time, would protect them on the left. He then issued orders about lights on the ships. Men of war were to have 1 each, and freighters 2, while the identifying feature of the flagship in the dark would be 3 lights. Scipio told the helmsman to steer a course for Emporia. This was very fertile farmland, and so the area abounded in produce of all kinds, and also had a native population with little aptitude for war, as so often happens when the soil is rich. It therefore seemed likely these people could be crushed before help could be brought from Carthage. After issuing these instructions, Scipio ordered the men to return to their ships with a prayer for heaven's blessings on the enterprise, bade them set sail the following day when given the signal. '26. Numerous Roman fleets had set out from Sicily, and indeed from that very harbor, but no departure had provided such a spectacle as this, either in that war, which was not surprising since most of the fleets leaving had only been on raiding expeditions, or even in the first Punic War. And yet, if one took into account only the size of the fleet, then admittedly 2 pairs of consuls with 2 armies had also made the crossing in the past. and in their fleet the number of warships was as great as the number of freighters, with which Scipio was then making his crossing. For apart from the 40 men of war, he was taking the army over on some 400 freighters. But the second war seemed to the Romans more serious than the earlier one because the hostilities were taking place in Italy, and also because of the terrible losses of so many armies, with their leaders also being killed. In addition, the commander, Scipio, had a great talent for boosting his own reputation, and he had now become the talk of the town and focused men's attention on him, both by his brave deeds and his own personal good fortune. And then there was the very idea of the crossing, attempted by no other commander before him in that war, for Scipio had made it known that the purpose of his voyage was to draw Hannibal away from Italy, carry over the war to Africa, and finish it there. Not only had all the inhabitants of Lilybaeum come running in droves to the harbor to witness the event, but so too had legations from all over Sicily. The latter had assembled to pay their respects and see Scipio off on his journey, or had travelled there with Marcus Pomponius, the praetor of the province. In addition, the legions that were being left behind in Sicily had come to see their comrades off, but it was not just a case of the fleet providing a slight But it was not just a case of the fleet providing a sight for the onlookers on shore. Those on board also had the spectacle of the entire shoreline covered with milling crowds. 27. At daybreak, Scipio had a herald's call for silence, and from the flagship he offered the following prayer: Gods and goddesses, who dwell in the seas and on the land, I pray and beseech you, whatever has been done, is being done, and will hereafter be done under my command. May that turn out well for me, for the people and plebs of Rome, and for our allies and Latins who follow the lead authority and auspices of the Roman people and myself, by land, sea, and river, kindly assist all these deeds of ours, and crown them with success, and the enemy defeated, bring the victors home with me safe and sound, bedecked with spoils, laden with plunder, and triumphant. Grant us the ability to take retribution from those who hate us and fight us, and give to me and the Roman people the opportunity to inflict on the state of Carthage the punishments that the Carthaginian people has endeavored to inflict on ours. After this prayer, Scipio followed the traditional practice of slaughtering a sacrificial animal and throwing its raw entrails into the sea. He then had the signal for departure sounded on a trumpet, surging forward before a wind of some force. They were quickly swept out of sight of land. After midday, a mist began to rise, so thick that the ships could barely avoid colliding with each other, and the wind became calmer on the open sea. The fog remained just as dense during the oncoming night, but with the sunrise it dispatched and the wind picked up. Now they began to sight land. Shortly afterwards, the helmsman told Scipio that Africa lay no more than 5 miles away, and that he could see the promontory of Mercury. If Scipio gave him the order to steer in that direction, he said, the entire fleet would be in port in no time. When he had land in view, Scipio prayed to the gods, asking them to make his sighting of Africa bode well for the Republic and for himself, and he then gave the order to unfurl the sails and head for another landing spot further along. They were now scudding before the same wind, But at about the same time as the previous day the mist arose to cut off all sight of land, and with the onset of the mist the wind fell. Night then increased the disorientation everywhere, and they dropped anchor to stop the ships from colliding with each other or running aground. With the break of day, the same wind arose once more, unveiling a panorama of the coastline of Africa. Scipio asked the name of the closest headland, and when he was told it was called the Headland of the Beautiful One, he said, "The omen pleases me. Head the ships towards it." The fleet put in there, and all the troops were set ashore. In describing the voyage as being a fair one, free of panic and confusion, I have accepted the account of a large number of Greek and Roman authorities. Coelius alone differs. While he stopped short of having the ship submerged by the waves, he does bring in all other terrifying phenomena that can come from sky or sea. He finally has the fleet driven away from Africa by a storm that brought it to the island of Aegimerus, where, with difficulty, it re-established its course. Then, with the ships on the verge of sinking, Coelius has the men take boats without the commander's order and make an absolutely chaotic landing without their weapons, just as if they had been shipwrecked. (28) When the troops had been put ashore, the Romans measured out their camp on some nearby hills. By now, the sight of the fleet, first of all, and then the commotion of the men landing, had brought a frantic dread not merely to the farmlands bordering the sea, but to the cities too. Crowds of men, with columns of women and children among them, had clogged the roads everywhere. But in addition to that, there were also peasants driving their animals before them. One might have said Africa was suddenly being abandoned. In fact, in the cities, these people were bringing panic greater than they felt themselves when they arrived, and the chaos in Carthage, in particular, was close to that of a captured city. For in the almost 50 years since the consulship of Marcus Attilius Regulus and Lucius Manlius, its people had not set eyes on a single Roman army, with the exception of some marauding fleets, from which raids had been conducted on the coastal farmland. And in those cases, once the pillaging of whatever chance put in the marauders' way was completed, there had always been a dash back to the ships before the commotion could alert the royal population. Hence the heightened excitement and panic in the city on this occasion. And there was, in fact, another consideration. They had at home neither a strong enough army nor a strong enough commander to field against the Romans. Hasdrubal, son of Gisgo, was by far the leading man in the community, by virtue of his breeding, reputation, wealth, and at that time even a family connection with royalty. But people remembered that he had been defeated and put to flight by the very same Scipio in a number of battles in Spain, and they thought that as a commander he was just as unevenly matched with Scipio as their makeshift army was with the Roman force. And so, as if Scipio were on the verge of attacking the city, the call to arms went up, gates were hurriedly closed, armed men posted on the walls, and sentries and outposts put in place, and there was little sleep during the oncoming night. The next day 500 horsemen were dispatched to the sea to reconnoitre and also to harass the Romans as they disembarked, and these ran into some Roman outpost. For by now Scipio, having sent his fleet on towards Utica, had advanced a short distance from the sea, and seized the closest high ground. He had then positioned his cavalry on guard at suitable points, and sent others to raid the fields. 29. These men engaged the Carthaginian cavalry squadron, killing a few in the actual engagement, but a large number as they chased them off, including their captain Hano, a young nobleman. Scipio not only laid waste the fields in the area, but also captured the closest city of the Africans, which was quite a prosperous. Scipio not only laid waste the fields in the area, but also captured the closest city of the Africans, which was quite prosperous, a town. In addition to the spoils, which were immediately put aboard the freighters and shipped off to Sicily, 8,000 prisoners of war, both freemen and slaves, were taken. However, what most pleased the Romans at the start of this operation was the arrival of Massinissa. Some sources claim that he came with no more than 200 horsemen, but most say that he had with him a cavalry force of 2,000. Massinissa was by far the greatest of the monarchs of his day, and it was he who provided the greatest assistance for the Roman cause. A brief excursus on the checkered fortunes the king experienced in losing and regaining his father's throne therefore seems appropriate. Massinissa's father, whose name was Gala, died when Massinissa was fighting for the Carthaginians in Spain. The throne then passed, in conformity with Numidian tradition, to the late king's very aged brother Ozalkes. Ozalkes also died not much later, and the elder of his two sons, Capuzza, inherited his father's realm, the other son being just a boy. However, Capuzza was succeeding to the throne thanks more to tribal law than because of any authority he wielded amongst his people or any power he had, and a man called Mazaeotulus now came on the scene. Mazaeotulus was a blood relation of the royal family, but he came from a house that had always opposed it, and which had, with varying degrees of success, disputed the throne with those in power at that time. He stirred up his compatriots, with whom he carried great weight because of the antipathy they also felt for the royal family, and he quite openly started a military campaign forcing the king to take the field and fight for his throne. In that battle Capuzza lost his life, as did many of his leading citizens. The tribe of the Masuli then fell entirely under Mazaeotulus's authority and power, but Mazaeotulus avoided assuming the title of king. Happy enough with a modest title, guardian, he conferred that of king on the boy Lacumazes, sole survivor of the royal line. He married a well-born Carthaginian lady, a daughter of Hannibal's sister, who had recently been the wife of King Ozalkes, hoping thereby to gain an alliance with the Carthaginians. And he also sent a deputation to renew his former ties of hospitality with Sfax. These were all means of support against Massinissa, that he was putting in place in advance. 30. When he heard that his uncle had died and that his cousin had been killed, Massinissa crossed from Spain to Mauritania, where at the time Bega was king of the Moors. Petitioning Bega with the most wretched entreaties, he obtained from him a contingent of 4,000 Moors to assist him on his journey, though his appeal for military assistance failed. After sending ahead a messenger to his own friends and those of his father, he came with the Moors to the borders of the kingdom, where about 500 Numidians rallied to his cause. Massinissa then sent the Moors back to the king, as had been agreed. He was now left with a body of men considerably smaller than he had hoped for, and one insufficient for undertaking the great enterprise he had planned. But he thought that with a vigorous and energetic push he would accumulate forces enough to bring off something. He then encountered Lacomazes near Thapsus, as the prince was setting out to visit Sfax. Lacomazes' army panicked and fled back into the city, which Massinissa then took at the first assault, accepting the surrender of some of the prince's men and killing others as they prepared to resist. During the confusion, most of Lacomazes' force, including the boy himself, continued on their journey and reached Sfax. Minor though the victory was, news of it right at the start of the campaign drew the Numidians over to Massinissa, and veterans of Gala came streaming to him from all parts of the countryside and from all the villages, encouraging the young man to recover his father's throne. Massiatulus considerably outnumbered Massinissa. He still had the army with which he had defeated Capuzza, and he also had some of Capuzza's men, whom he had taken on after the death of the king. In addition, the young Lacomazes had brought him enormous auxiliary forces from Sfax. In fact, Massiatulus had 15,000 infantrymen and 10,000 cavalrymen when he clashed with Massinissa, who had nothing like as many of either. Nevertheless, the day was won by the fighting ability of the veteran troops and the capability of a leader who had received his training in the Roman-Punic conflict. The prince fled into Carthaginian territory with his guardian and a small group of Massylians. Massinissa had thus recovered his father's throne, but he could see that he was left with a struggle against Sfax that was of considerably greater proportions. Thinking it best, therefore, to make up with his cousin, he sent men to give the boy hope that, if he put himself in Massinissa's hands, he would be held in the same esteem as Ozalkes had earlier been held in Gala's court. They were also to promise Massiatulus that not only would he receive no punishment, but he would also have all his property faithfully restored to him. The two men preferred a modest estate at home to exile, and Massinissa, despite Carthaginian efforts to prevent it, won them over to his side. 31. It so happened that while this was taking place, Hasdrubal was at the court of Sfax. Sfax believed that it made little difference to him whether the kingdom of the Massylians was in the hands of Lacomazes or Massinissa, but Hasdrubal, told them he was making a big mistake if he thought Massinissa would be satisfied with the same territory as his father Gela or his uncle Ozalkes. The man, he explained, was possessed of a much greater spirit and intelligence than had ever been in any member of his race, and in Spain he had exhibited, before allies and enemies alike, a courage rarely found in humankind. If they did not quench that flame, as it was on the rise, both Sfax and the Carthaginians would soon be engulfed in a huge conflagration with which they simply could not cope. Up until that point, he said, Massinissa's power had been weak and fragile as he tried to nurture a kingdom that had only just begun to coalesce. By pressing his point and egging on Sfax, Hasdrubal convinced him to move his forces up to the border with the Masulians and pitch his camp on land that he had not only disputed but actually fought over with Gela, and to do so as though it were his undeniable right. He told him that if anyone tried to drive him off, he should fight him in pitched battle, which would be the preferred option if the Masulians should quit the area through fear. He should advance to the heart of their kingdom. The Masulians would either submit to his authority without resistance or would prove no match for him in battle. Spurred on by such comments, Sfax opened hostilities against Massinissa. In the first encounter he defeated the Masulians and put them to flight, and Massinissa, along with a few horsemen, fled from the battlefield to a mountain called Balis by the natives. A number of families accompanied their king, taking with them their huts and animals, the only property those people possess. The rest of the Masulian population submitted to Sfax's authority. The mountain occupied it was good for raising cattle. The mountain occupied by the fugitives is grassy, with a good water supply, and because it is good for raising cattle, it also afforded an abundant supply of food for men whose diet consisted of meat and milk. From that vantage point they began with clandestine forays at night, and then moved on to open marauding, rendering the whole surrounding area insecure. It was Carthaginian farmland, in the main, that went up in smoke, because there was more plunder to be had there than amongst the Numidians, and also because marauding was safer there. Soon they acted with such unchecked effrontery that they were carrying their booty down to the shore and selling it to merchants, who brought their vessels to land for that purpose. And more Carthaginians were killed or taken prisoner than was often the case in regular warfare. The Carthaginians lodged complaints about this with Sfax. They proceeded to urge him, and he was himself incensed at the situation, to finish the mopping up operations of the war, but it seemed to him beneath his royal dignity to be chasing a vagabond robber in the hills. 32. One of the king's officers, Bukar, a man of energy and action, was chosen for the task. He was given 4,000 infantry and 2,000 cavalry, and plied with promises of huge rewards if he brought back He was given 4,000 infantry and 2,000 cavalry, and plied with promises of huge rewards if he brought back Massinissa's head, or something that would provide immense satisfaction if he took him alive. The marauders were scattered and off their guard when Bukar made a surprise attack on them. He managed to cut a large number of cattle and men off from their armored escort, and drove Massinissa himself and a few of his men to the peak of the mountain. Then, assuming the campaign to be now almost finished, he not only dispatched the booty, that is, the cattle and men he had captured, to the king, but also sent back some of his troops, feeling that he had considerably more than were needed for what remained of the war. When Massinissa came down from the high ground, Bukar gave chase with no more than 500 infantrymen and 200 cavalrymen, and cornered him in a narrow ravine which he blocked at both ends. In the ravine the Masulians suffered terrible carnage, but Massinissa, with not more than 50 horsemen, extricated himself by taking some mountain passes that were unknown to his pursuers. Bukar, however, dogged his footsteps and overtook him in some open country near the city of Clupea, and there he had him so completely surrounded that, with the exception of 4 horsemen, he killed all of Massinissa's men. Massinissa himself was wounded, but in the confusion Bukar let him and the 4 slip through his fingers. The fleeing men were in full view, and a squadron of cavalry set off in pursuit of its 5 enemies, spreading over the plain, with some cutting across in an effort to head them off. A large river was what the fugitives encountered next, and they headed their mounts into it with no hesitation, driven as they were by fear of a greater danger. Gripped by the swirling current, they were swept downstream at an angle past their pursuers. 2 were swallowed up in the rushing torrent before their enemies' eyes, and it was thought that Massinissa himself had perished. But the 2 remaining cavalrymen actually climbed out together with him amidst some bushes on the far bank. That was the end of the chase for Bukar. He would not risk entering the river, and he believed he now had no one to pursue. He returned to the king with the erroneous report that Massinissa had perished, and men were dispatched to take this immensely joyous news to Carthage. The story of Massinissa's death was carried throughout Africa, prompting varied reactions. As he tended his wounds with herbs, Massinissa lived for a number of days in a hidden cavern on what the 2 horsemen could steal. As soon as the wound had scabbed over, and he felt he could stand the jolting of travel, he went on his way with extraordinary bravado to reclaim his throne. He picked up no more than 30 horsemen en route, and with them he came to the Masulians, making no secret of his identity. He created great excitement thanks to his earlier popularity, and also because of the unexpected joy that people felt at seeing safe and sound a man they thought had perished. The result was that in a few days 6,000 armed foot soldiers and 4,000 cavalry came flocking to him, and he was now not simply in possession of his father's throne, but was even plundering tribes allied to Carthage, and the lands of the Masulians, that is to say, Sphax's kingdom. After goading Sphax into war like this, Massinissa next took up a position between Cirta and Hippo on some hills that suited his purpose in all respects. 33. Sphax now felt the matter was too serious for him to handle through his officers. He sent off his young son, whose name was Vermina, with a section of his army, ordering him to take his column around the enemy and launch an attack from the rear while their attention was focused on Sfax himself. Since he was going to be making a surprise attack, Vermina set out at night, and Sfax then struck camp in daylight, marching in the open, apparently intending to fight a regular pitched battle. When he felt enough time had elapsed for those executing the encircling maneuver to have reached their position, Sfax embarked on a gentle slope that led to the enemy, and relying both on his superior numbers and on the trap set to the enemy's rear, brought his battle line straight up the hill. Massinissa, relying mostly on his position, which would enable him to fight on ground much more favorable to him, also formed up his men. It was a fierce battle that long remained indecisive, with the position and the valor of his soldiers aiding Massinissa, and numbers in which he was overwhelmingly superior aided Sfax. And those superior numbers, which were in two parts, one putting pressure on the enemy in front and the other having moved around to attack the rear, gave Sfax a conclusive victory, and did not even leave a mean of escape open to the enemy, who were blocked front and rear. And so the infantry and cavalry were all cut down or captured, apart from about 200 cavalrymen. Massinissa gathered these in a body around him, and split them into 3 sections. He then gave orders to break through the enemy, and told them where to regroup after they became dispersed in their flight. Massinissa himself made his way through the midst of the enemy, weapons by the en route he had designated for himself, but the other 2 squadrons were brought to a halt. One, from fear, surrendered to the enemy, and the other, more determined in its resistance, went down under a hail of javelins. Vermina stuck closely to Massinissa's heels, but the king gave him the slip by constantly turning off into different roads, and eventually forced him to abandon a pursuit that had become tiresome and discouraging. He reached the Lesser Syrtis with 60 cavalrymen, there proudly aware that he had on numerous occasions tried to reclaim his father's throne. He spent all his time between Punic Emporia and the tribe of the Garamantes, until Gaius Laelius and the Roman fleet arrived in Africa. This makes me incline to the view that it was with a modest force rather than a large one that Massinissa subsequently came to Scipio. Large numbers are more in keeping with a man who is on the throne. My suggestion of smaller numbers better suits the circumstances of the exile. After losing a cavalry squadron, together with its commander, the Carthaginians raised other cavalry with a new levy, and put it under the command of Hanno, son of Hamilcar. They put out repeated summonses to Hasdrubal and Sfax by dispatches and messengers initially, and finally even by embassies. They sent orders to Hasdrubal to bring aid to his native city, which was virtually under siege, and they pleaded with Sfax to come to the support of Carthage and the whole of Africa. At that point Scipio was at Utica, encamped about a mile from the city. He had moved it there from the coast, where for a few days he had maintained a base close to the fleet. Hanno had been assigned cavalry, in no way strong enough to give the enemy any trouble, or even protect the countryside from depredation, and so he made raising his cavalry members with a troop levy his first priority. He did not reject other nationalities, but in the main he hired Numidians, theirs being by far the leading cavalry nation in Africa. When now he had around 4,000 cavalry in his force, he took over a town called Seleucia, about 15 miles from the Roman camp. Brought the news of this, Scipio declared, "Horsemen passing the summer under shelter. Let there be more of them, as long as they have a leader of that caliber." Thinking the Carthaginians' lethargic performance was all the more reason for him not to waste time, Scipio met Massinissa ahead with his cavalry, ordering him to ride up to the city gates and draw the enemy out to fight. When the enemy had come out in full force and was too formidable in the engagement to be easily withstood, Massinissa was to give ground gradually, and Scipio would join the battle at the appropriate moment. Massinissa then went ahead, and Scipio waited only as long as appeared sufficient for him to draw out the enemy, and then followed with the Roman cavalry. Thanks to the cover of some hills, which were conveniently screened, which very conveniently screened the winding road on both sides, his advance went unnoticed. Massinissa now proceeded according to plan, affecting in turn to threaten the enemy, and to take fright himself. He would ride right up to the gates, or he would fall back, and, building his enemy's confidence with simulated fear, draw them into foolhardy pursuit. They had not all emerged from the town, and their leader had his hands full coping with various tasks, some of them men torpid from drink and sleep. He was forcing to take up their weapons and bridle their horses. Others he was restraining from disorderly and unruly sorties from all the gates, out of formation and without their standards. Massinissa faced up to their first hasty onslaughts. Soon, however, more men came pouring out in a dense body from one of the gates, making it an evenly matched contest. Finally, their entire cavalry came into the battle, and resistance was no longer possible. But when Massinissa gave ground, it was not in disordered flight. Falling back gradually, he would parry their assaults until he drew them up to the hills that concealed the Roman cavalry. The cavalry then emerged from the hills, their strength intact and their horses fresh, and surrounded Hanno and his Africans, who were exhausted from the fight and the chase, and Massinissa, too, suddenly wheeling around his horses, returned to battle. About 1,000 men, who had formed the head of the column, and for whom retreat was not easy, were cut off and killed, and along with them fell their commander, Hanno. The others fled in disorder, especially panic-stricken by their leader's death, and the victors chased them for 30 miles, capturing or killing a further 2,000 cavalrymen. It was a well-established fact that these included no fewer than 200 Carthaginian horsemen, a number of them noted for their wealth and noble birth. 35. It so happened that, on the very day that these events took place, the ships that had transported the plunder to Sicily came back with supplies. It was as if they had had a premonition that the point of their return was to pick up a second cargo of booty. Not all sources have an account of 2 Carthaginian commanders of the same name being killed in 2 separate cavalry engagements, because I suppose they were afraid of making a mistake and producing a doublet of the same incident. Coelius and Valerius, in fact, even have Hanno taken prisoner. Scipio conferred gifts of honor on the officers and cavalrymen, according to the service provided by each, and above all on Massinissa. He then installed a strong garrison in Silesia. He then installed a strong garrison at Salaca, and set out in person with the rest of the army. He not only laid waste the fields all along his route, but he also took a number of cities and villages by storm, spreading the terror of war far and wide. On the 7th day after the departure he returned to his camp with large numbers of men, cattle, and all other sorts of booty in tow, and he sent off the ships laden once more with enemy spoils. Scipio now abandoned minor operations and pillaging expeditions to concentrate all his military resources on an assault on Utica, which, if he captured it, he would use as a base for the rest of his campaign. The seamen from the fleet were brought up to the city on the side that was bordered by the sea, and at the same time the land forces were brought up at a point where a hill overlooked the very walls of the city. As for artillery and siege engines, some he had brought with him, more had been sent from Sicily with the supplies, and new ones were under construction in an arsenal where large numbers of craftsmen, who specialized in such work, had been confined for this purpose. Under pressure on every side from such a massive force, the people of Utica had all their hopes pinned on the Carthaginian people, and the Carthaginians had theirs pinned on Hasdrubal, that is to say, on his convincing Sphax to act. But all was proceeding too slowly for the liking of those needing the assistance. Hasdrubal had managed to raise about 30,000 infantry and 3,000 cavalry with an extremely energetic recruiting drive, but he still did not dare move his camp closer to the enemy before Sphax arrived. Sphax came with 50,000 infantry and 10,000 cavalry, and after swiftly moving camp from Carthage, he took up a position not far from Utica and the Roman entrenchments. Their arrival did have one important result. It made Scipio withdraw from Utica, his venture a failure, after a siege of some 40 days in which everything he tried came to nothing. With winter now coming on, he established fortified winter quarters on a promontory that runs some distance out to sea and is connected to the mainland by a narrow spit of land, and within a single circumvallation he enclosed the naval camp as well. The legionary camp was placed in the center of the isthmus. The northern section was taken up by the beached ships and their crews, and the lower ground to the south that ran down to the other shore was occupied by cavalry. Such were operations in Africa up till the end of autumn. (36) Grain had been stockpiled from the raids on all the surrounding countryside, and there had also been supplies imported from Sicily and Italy. In addition, the proprietor, Gnaeus Octavius, had shipped in from Sardinia copious quantities that he had obtained from the praetor Tiberius Claudius, whose province it was. Not only were the granaries full that had been built earlier, but new ones were constructed as well. The army was short of clothing, and Octavius was instructed to negotiate with the praetor to see what could be supplied and transported there from the province. The matter was promptly taken care of, and in no time 1,200 togas and 12,000 tunics were dispatched. During the summer of these events in Africa, the consul Publius Sempronius, whose area of responsibility was Brutium, fought a scrappy engagement with Hannibal in the region of Croton while the armies were actually on the march, and it was a fight between marching columns rather than a pitched battle. The Romans were driven back, and roughly 1,200 of the consul's army lost their lives in what could more accurately be termed a brawl than a battle. Sempronius's men retreated in panic to their camp, but even so the enemy did not risk attacking it. In fact, that night, when all was quiet, the consul left the camp, and, after sending a messenger ahead to the proconsul Publius Licinius to tell him to bring up his legions, he then joined forces with him. Thus 2 commanders and 2 armies came back to face Hannibal, and the engagement was not put off, since the consul was encouraged by the doubling of his strength, and the Carthaginian by his recent victory. Sempronius brought his own legions into the front line, and Publius Licinius' legions were kept in reserve. At the start of the battle, the consul made a vow of a temple to Fortuna Primigenia, in the event of his routing the enemy that day, and he had his prayer granted. The Carthaginians were defeated and put to flight, with more than 4,000 soldiers killed and slightly fewer than 300 taken alive, and with 50 horses and 11 military standards captured. Shaken by the defeat, Hannibal led his army away to Croton. Meanwhile, at the other end of Italy, Etruria had almost entirely transferred its support to Mago, hoping that a change of regime could be effected through him, and the consul Marcus Cornelius maintained control less by armed force than by the dread generated by his judicial proceedings. Cornelius conducted his inquiries, which were mandated by a senatorial decree, with complete impartiality. And at the start, there had been numerous appearances and condemnations of Etruscan noblemen who had either themselves gone to Mago or corresponded with him about the defection of their people. Later, some opted for a self-imposed exile through consciousness of their guilt and were condemned in absentia. In this way, they avoided the death penalty and offered only their property, which faced possible confiscation as a security for their punishment. 37. Meanwhile, in Rome, during the time that the consuls were engaged in these operations in the separate regions, the censors Marcus Livius and Gaius Claudius read out the senatorial register. Quintus Fabius Maximus was chosen leader of the house for the second time, and 7 men received the mark of disgrace, though none was a holder of a curule chair. The censors conducted rigorous and absolutely thorough surveys of building repairs. They put out for contract the construction of a road from the Forum Boarium to the Temple of Venus, bypassing the spectators' seats, and for a temple of the Magna Mater on the Palatine. They also imposed a new tax on the sale of salt. At Rome and throughout Italy, salt was selling for 1/6 of an as. The censors put out contracts for it now to be sold at the same price as before in Rome, at a higher price in the market towns and administrative centres, and at various prices elsewhere according to the locality. There was a widespread belief that it was just one of the censors who dreamed up this tax. He was angry with the people, it was said, over a wrongful conviction he had once received in court, and it was the tribes who had been responsible for his conviction who were burdened most of his adjustments of the price of salt. That was why he, Livius, was given the surname Salinator. The 5-year purification ceremony took place later than usual because the censors sent agents through the provinces to report on the number of Roman citizens who were in the armies in the various locations. With these included, the census numbered 214,000 souls. Gaius Claudius Nero performed the 5-year purification ceremony. The censors then received the census of the 12 colonies submitted by the censors of the actual colonies, which was an unprecedented procedure. Its purpose was to ensure that there was in the public records documentation of the colony's strength in numbers of soldiers and financial resources. A census of the equestrian order was begun next, and it so happened that both censors were in possession of a public horse. When they came to the Polia tribe, in which Livius was enrolled, the herald balked at calling out the name of the censor himself. "Call Marcus Livius," said Nero. Whether some of the old antagonism between them still remained, or whether it was a self-important and untimely demonstration of uncompromising principle, Nero commanded Marcus Livius to sell his horse because of his conviction by the people. Similarly, when they came to the Arniensis tribe, and the name of his colleague, Marcus Livius commanded Gaius Claudius to sell his horse, citing 2 reasons. In the first place, he said, Claudius had borne false witness against him, and secondly, he had not been candid in his reconciliation with him. At the end of their censorship, there was an equally disgraceful competition between the 2 to sully the other's reputation, which only did harm to the reputation of both. When Gaius Claudius took the oath that he had acted according to the laws and had grown up to the treasury, he placed amongst the names of those whom he demoted to the status of poll tax payers and of the colleague. After that, Marcus Livius came into the treasury. There, with the exception of the Masia tribe, which had not participated in the conviction, but which had also refused to elect him either consul or censor after the conviction, he left with the status of poll tax payers, the entire Roman people, all 34 tribes. His reasoning, he said, was that the people had convicted an innocent man, but that, after convicting him, they had elected him consul and censor, and they had to admit now that they had either been mistaken once in their initial judgment or twice in the elections. Livius went on to say that among the 34 tribes was Gaius Claudius, who would also become a poll tax payer. Had he had a precedent for twice leaving the same man with poll tax paying status, he declared he would have left Gaius Claudius by name in that category. This squabble between the censors over assigning the mark of disgrace was unbecoming, but the censorial condemnation of the fickleness of the mob was in keeping with the earnest nature of the times. The censors were now in bad odor, and the plebeian tribune, Gnaeus Baebius, thinking that he had a chance to make political capital at their expense, served a summons for both to appear before the people. The procedure was blocked by a unanimous decision of the senators, for fear that the office of censor be put at the mercy of the whim of the people. 38. That same summer, in Bruttium, Clampetia was taken by storm by the consul, and Consentia, Pandosia, and other communities of little consequence submitted to him of their own volition. Since the time for the elections was now approaching, the preferred choice was to have Cornelius brought back from Etruria, where there were no hostilities. Cornelius oversaw the election of Gnaeus Servilius Capio and Gaius Servilius Geminus as consuls. The Praetorian elections were held next, and those elected were Publius Cornelius Lentulus, Publius Quintilius Varus, Publius Aelius Paetus, and Publius Villius Tepulus. The last two of these were elected to the praetorship. The last two of these were elected to the praetor. I'm sorry. The last two of these were elected to the praetorship while they were serving as plebeian aediles. The election over the consul returned to his army in Etruria. Priests who died that year, and their replacements were as follows. Tiberius Veturius Philo was elected and inaugurated as Flamen of Mars to replace Marcus Aemilius Regillus, who had died the year before. To replace Marcus Pomponius Matho in his positions as Augur and Decemvir, Marcus Aurelius Cotta was elected Decemvir, and Tiberius Sempronius Gracchus was elected Augur, although he was very young, and this very rarely occurred in the allocation of priesthoods in those days. A gilded four-horse chariot was that year set on the Capitol by the curule aediles Gaius Livius and Marcus Servilius Geminus. The Roman games were repeated over a 2-day period, and the plebeian games were likewise repeated for 2 days by the aediles Publius Aelius and Publius Villius. There was also a banquet for Jupiter held in honor of the games. End of Book 29.